They'd be like floaties, I suppose. Anyway, please welcome Jean BAS from Jean BAS Studio.
We have some right here and there's one, and I think it can be very interesting.
Yeah. No, it's just baffling to me. Why is it so impossible to put together a decent run-through? You people have had hours and hours to prepare. It's just so confusing to me. Where are the advertisers?
We have some pieces from Banana Republic.
Oh, we need more, don't we? Oh, Jesus. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, you know me. Give me a full ballerina skirt and a hint of saloon, and I'm on board.
But do you think it's too much like...
What? On July? I thought that. No, not with the red accessories. It should work.
Where are the belts for this strap? Why is no one wearing it?
It's a tough call. They're so different.
Something funny?
No, it's just that both of those belts look exactly the same to me, I'm still learning about this stuff and,
This stuff? Oh, okay, I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back, but what you don't know is that that sweater is not just blue, it's not turquoise, it's not lapis, it's actually cerulean. And you're also blindly unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns, and then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets. I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in collections of 8 different designers. And it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you had fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
And I love following Meryl straight after. The history of taste and fashion is a history of preferences, as you just saw, of various acts of choices between given alternatives. That lumpy cerulean sweater or lapis belt or the burnt orange velvet box jacket. Thank you, Miranda Priestley. But we have long come to realise that clothing design is not produced in an empty space. No designer or artist is independent of predecessors, craftsmen, inventors, or innovators. Tonight, we weave all those threads into a jolly great yarn, actually. A yarn that pays homage to all and indeed celebrates the many, many thousands of people, the cotton, the silk, the linen, flax, wool manufacturers and growers, the shearers, the furriers, weavers, spinners, beaders, embroiderers, knitters, dyers, cutters, pattern makers, tailors, models, stylists, magazines, publishers, public relations professionals, photographers, and finally, there's you. You, the consumer, the final arbiter of the ultimate critique, who selects something designed and fashioned for you from a pile of stuff, or not. And this yarn's worth telling, so let's buckle up and climb into my time machine. And this is your captain speaking. Let me introduce myself. For those of you I've not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Jean BAS, and I'm a practicing architect for the body. But my buildings move, my buildings breathe. And my buildings sometimes morph into something quite different when the sun goes down. And as we travel in our time machine, I will show you a world of clothing through the eyes of a practitioner. Perhaps the art of seeing how to use your eyes. The mind is the real instrument of sight and observation. The eyes are just a vessel, maybe, receiving and transmitting the visible portion of consciousness. But you already knew that. American Vogue stylist Grace Coddington, in the September edition, spoke of her time working with well-known photographer Norman Parkinson, and we all know Norman Parkinson's work. Grace, he said, always keep your eyes open, never go to sleep. In the car, on a train, everywhere. Keep watching, for whatever you see out of the window can inspire you. Oh, did I tell you about my time machine? We were returning each day to my atelier in Derby Street, and in fact we'll begin each day there at dawn, and our time machine has the ability to go backwards or forwards or sidewards, because I'm the captain. Today I can think of no better place than to start our travel than the French courts during the reign of the Louis, 14th, 15th and 16th, all the Louis, and let's not forget Marie Antoinette. Historians widely regard the French Revolution as one of the most important anthropological events of history. I've always maintained that fashion is all about context, societal, cultural, historic, economic and political. But even I was shocked by what a huge paradigm shift occurred during the French Revolution. The sumptuous gowns, as you can see here, became so dazzlingly vast, and the wigs and headdresses so loftily high that architecture, interiors and furniture all had to be reimagined. And then in a moment, or so it seems to us, those dramatic silhouettes vanished to what you're seeing here, along with the royal courtiers and many of the courtiers' heads. And in their place were dresses so basic they resembled the simplest of gowns. These unbleached cotton garments had no infrastructure, no embellishments, clearly the costume of the peasants, the common folk, supporting the theory that fashion and history are inextricably linked. The French Revolution is in fact often seen as the marking of the dawn of the modern era. If I could talk to her shapeless gown, the terror that would reign, and if we had more time, she would tell us of the reign of terror where 40,000 of her countrymen lost their heads. And indeed, women tried desperately to have equal rights. And for all of that, they suffered by losing their heads as well, the women who marched on Versailles. The French history, take a look, it is astounding how it supports that one theory that fashion and history are inextricably linked. Before we leave France, however, I'd like to fast forward only just 100 years to 1876, and this is the year, although I didn't tell Prue, I thought I'd keep this one up my sleeve. She's one of my favourite, truly favourite designers, Madeleine Vionnet, and I know you've heard of her. Many of you know her as the queen of the bias cut. She was born in 1876. She was an astonishing lady, and our atelier has produced a lot of bias cut garments. They're cut on the cross, the 45-degree angle. They must be cut by hand. It's extremely important that they're absolutely on the 45. It allows the garment to reposition itself when it's hung and it's on the warmth of the body, and it moulds and hugs the wearer's curves. So you can imagine it was quite a provocative style from the structured garments that were previously worn. You can imagine the stir that V&A created in the 20s and 30s. She worked with silks and georgettes. Bias cutting is fastidious work. Each piece is carefully cut by hand, and as I said, it's draped. We hand finish our seams, and then we bind our seams with silk georgette in our atelier just around the corner. But it's so important that they get to sit, and then they do their magic. It'll be my life's work, I think, to conquer what she seemed to be gifted with from the gods, if you like, of the fabric world, to cut bias cut garments. She was an intensely private person, and this is one of the things I adore about her. She disliked the fashion world and all its frameworks. That's all right. It's very musical. We'll get to the music. Not only was she an architect amongst dressmakers, but she was also one of the great social influences. And I think this is what I loved about her so much. She was the one who fought for copyright laws. Very few people know that. She was the one who revolutionised labour practices of the time. Can you believe it? Paid holidays. Can you believe it? Maternity leave. Can you believe it? Daycare for children of her staff. And canteens that she set up within the factories that she had. A resident doctor and dentist as healthcare institutions. This lady was a real mover and shaker. She truly balanced the needs of the wealthy and the welfare of the needy. But unfortunately she closed down because of World War II, and that ended her reign. But when she came back after the war, you can see influences of a lot of her work: the cow neckline, the halter neck, the handkerchief dress. Her clothes that dominated the 1930s were worn by such well-known actresses as Marlene Dietrich, Katharine Hepburn and Greta Garbo. But she influenced Halston, John Galliano, Comme des Garçons and Izzy Miyake. She was a huge influencer, one of my favourites. And as I said, if I can breathe a small amount of what she had. And the interesting thing about Madeleine V&A is that she made her prototypes on little wooden dolls that were perhaps only 2 foot high. And that's where she learnt the art of cutting her bias and drape, those beautiful Grecian draped gowns that she worked with. It's late, and we need to return on our time machine, and we'll arrive at dawn on Derby Street. See you in my atelier. For tomorrow we cut silk, Armani silk. Welcome to my atelier. Do come in and mind the creative mixtures. As a practitioner involved in all aspects of the couture clothing process, I find myself often in a transfixed gaze, waiting for inspiration. An extraordinary piece of silk fail from a textile collection endorsed by Giorgio Armani finds its way onto my cutting table. The design hovers somewhere between a rock pool fountain and a pebble-based Japanese stream. We only have a portion of it here because we've cut it all up now, Mr. Coffee. The colour palette is a monochromatic dance of lead, charcoal, metal and beads of soft, almost icy liquid, mercuric silvers. What am I experiencing here? Do I celebrate the fountains, or would that make it too difficult a piece to wear? Or am I best to embrace the pebble-like shapes, balanced on rich portions of blackness, and sharpen the lines of the jacket's décolletage? I hear myself whisper, reveal yourself. Where are you? I know you're in there. It's a restless time as all the technicians wait. There wouldn't be an artist, designer, architect, writer, poet, songster who hasn't faced the dilemma of what do I leave in and what do I take out. The editing process, like the spaces between the notes in music, for after all it separates the notes and ultimately the sounds giving meaning, structure, rhythm and flow. It's a continual tension as we edit, discard those pieces that don't belong in this new building, the one crafted from threads. There's so much sheer emotional range invested in this process. And I feel the need for inspiration. Our time machine takes us to one of my favourite cities for clarity in revealing the creative process. My Firenze, Florence, and in particular the Accademia. The long room leading to Michelangelo's David houses the prisoners, our inspiration. And I remember taking my children to see this when they were quite young, 10 years of age. They never, ever forgot. These unfinished figures seem to be fighting to be free, to free themselves from the stone. Michelangelo believed the sculptor was the tool of God, not creating but simply revealing the powerful and beautiful figures he put in marble. Michelangelo's job was just to chip away the excess to reveal. He believed God's will, and whenever the Spirit came upon him, he worked in a frenzy, often for days without sleep. As a practitioner of the cloth, I align myself comfortably with the process of the sculptor. Some designers make up patterns, build models, refine and create a revised model, we call it a toile, and some, like Michelangelo, work freehand, starting from the front, as he did, always working to the back, or as Alexandra McQueen, the late Alexandra McQueen, and I must admit I love working from the side. I enjoy the shape of the S-bend, the true line that I'm searching for in the body. Our time machine returns. It's been an inspirational visit, I'm sure you'll agree. I'm refreshed, I feel a new vigour, and I cut. As the pieces fall to the cutting room floor, I reflect on all the silk farmers I've visited in India and Italy, the printers in Como, the fabric mills in Milano, the tailors I collaborate with and value, knowing that just the decision to remove parts of the whole to create a third dimension, to allow the building of a new design to commence, includes waste, leftovers and remnants, probably that will never be used. It seems it's taken me years to perfect this discipline, and it still evolves. All my technicians are with me as we wait patiently for the prison design to reveal itself. One of my most revered designers, Pierre Cardin, locked himself away in his atelier and crafted his own prototypes. I believe that it's through this process that you release the prisoners in the cloth. So our time machine actually needs to be serviced, and I know you won't mind that I'm going to introduce you to my first tutor for my dressmaking, and that's my beautiful sister, the perfectionist, Rosalie, right here in the little orange jacket. Would you like to stand up? She was the perfectionist and very bossy, don't be fooled. Okay. I think I'd like to introduce someone that I have an enormous respect for, and all of you do. She's had a questionable history, we know that, but we admire her, Coco Chanel. And she was the designer in Time magazine who was considered one of the most 100 influential people of the 20th century. The only designer they chose was Coco Chanel. I celebrate Karl Lagerfeld, but he is always reinventing Coco. His own label is not as successful, of course, but Coco Chanel was quite a liberated woman from the creates of the corseted silhouette. And I will take a break as we show you.
Once upon a time, in 1920, Coco became Mademoiselle. Europe had formed a fragile peace and women were embracing the style of the woman who had given them the right to comfort. Coco, who had just lost the love of her life, suppresses her sorrow in Venice, with Misia and José Maria Sert. Once upon a time there was Misia, the friend from Russia, faithful and formidable, the whimsical muse, friendly flashback inspiration to Proust, celebrating pianist and model for Toulouse-Lautrec, Renoir, Bonnard and Vuillard. Misia inspires Mademoiselle to fall in love with Italy and the Ballet Russe, and introduces her to her friends Cocteau, Stravinsky, Diaghilev, Ravel and Picasso. Once upon a time, Couturière was beloved by artists. She designs costumes for the theatrical presentations of Dumas and Cocteau, finances the Rite of Spring, houses Stravinsky and his family, helps Cocteau during his rehabilitation, discreetly arranges the burial of Diaghilev in Venice. Once upon a time there was a prosperous Russian, the Grand Duke Dmitri, refugee from the Great Bolshevik Revolution, the lover with a melancholy gaze. She's 8 years older than he. Dmitri infuses her collections with influences from the steppes of Russia, inspiring embroidery, furs and Byzantine jewels. Thanks to him, Mademoiselle meets Ernest Beau, perfumer to the Tsars, who creates in 1921 the ultimate perfume, number 5. Once upon a time there was a gentleman with an English elegance, a luxury beyond aristocracy, the Duke of Westminster, the richest man in England. Gabriel is inspired by his tweed jackets and his knit sweaters, by the vests of his valets, by the berets of his sailors. They fall in love. Westminster invites her to his houses and on board his yachts, sends a private train to connect and showers her with flowers and jewels. Their love soon wanes, she never become a duchess. Once upon a time, black assumed the throne. At the opera, before the motley kaleidoscope of gaudy gowns, Gabrielle Chanel declares her distaste for the era, announcing, "These women are bloody well going to dress them in black." Formerly reserved for house servants or for mourning, black becomes the ultimate colour and the key to her success. The little black dress is born. Once upon a time there were costume jewels which Gabrielle Chanel loved to mix with precious stones. She reproaches the women of the world for wearing their fortunes around their necks, saying, "What counts is not the carrots but the illusion." Once upon a time, a triumph. The whole world wants to wear Chanel, including Hollywood, but Gabrielle quickly moves beyond the caprices of the silver screen and returns to France, establishing herself at the Ritz. Once upon a time in 1936, a company's founder is faced with 4,000 workers on strike during the spring of the Popular Front. They dare to defy her. Mademoiselle, by nature so unyielding, gives in. Once upon a time, the Second World War was announced. At 55 years, at the height of her glory, Gabrielle Chanel closes the atelier on the Rue Cambon. Convinced that this is no longer the time for fashion, she withdraws to Switzerland. But as one would like to say, "I want to be part of what happens," Mademoiselle was far from having said her last word.
Thank you, Kevin. And World War II did break out. Am I on? And World War II did break out. The global war, the deadliest conflict in history, because, as we all know, it included all the great powers. And I just want to recap very quickly through the war because there were so many social changes. Women took on military-style garments, fabric rationing was enforced, so the silhouette became narrow and shorter. The Jap silk was banned in USA after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And development of rayon, which I absolutely like rayon as a fabric, because all the other fabrics were needed in the war. The wool, the leather, the metal. It's unbelievable to think that coupon rationing meant that we restricted right through to the nylon stockings. And some of you here will remember, if not yourself, your mothers will tell you of what it was like. But what I love is that Harvey Nichols designed a suit. It was like a gas protection suit. He's catching up to me. in a variety of, they weren't offended by the Pearl Harbor, so they had it in a variety of oilskin silks. And it was pretty much a jumpsuit. It had zippers and it had pockets for all the papers and valuables in case the siren blew. We know it as the jumpsuit or the onesie, and we still use it. After the war, Paris lost its influence over fashion. Got me. There he is. Look at the girls, shorter skirts. And I think we have to admit that Chanel's highly competitive, opportunistic personality led her to make questionable life choices which have generated controversy around her reputation, particularly her behaviour during the German occupation of France in World War II. So the world focused for a short time on American fashion, which was actually a good thing. So the denim jeans, the gingham, calico, all the different silhouettes that were influenced from the American way of life. The military, by the way, didn't need sequins and crystals and bling, so Hollywood seemed to engage in all the glitter from day into evening wear. Girdles were out, the war needed the rubber, not the rubble, that was what was in it. Two-piece swimsuits were invented because you could use less fabrics. Heels were lowered. The introduction of the wedge heel was designed. Pants were de rigueur, and yes, Prue, shoulder pegs were compulsory. 'Twas the military look. And I understand why it was such a big deal when Dior over here hit the stage with all that sumptuous use of fabrics, all that extreme cut of cloth. It really shocked the frugal people that had lived abstemiously during that period. But little do you know that Dior's head of design was Pierre Cardin. And if you look at that shape, the circle, the bubble, Dior himself said, I owe 50% of that to Pierre Cardin, who 3 years later began his own label. I love Pierre Cardin. I think if archaeologists were to dig him up or dig up the work of designers through history, they would recognise him instantly. The huge collars, the shapes that don't really celebrate the female form, the bubble, as you can see here, his great love with the daring cuts, minimal geometric forms and quality fabrics. He was also the first to license products, to put his logo on the outside of garments. And he was the first in 1979 to put a fashion show on the Great Wall of China. He was also the first to take high-end fashion to Japan. He stayed for 3 months to teach them how to do three-dimensional pattern making. He also decided he wanted to appeal to the masses, so he introduced ranges that were sold into department stores, which horrified the French to make so many of the same high-end product at a lesser price. And many of his clothes are still worn today. But as we return to my atelier in the time machine and the influences of fibre and thread on our lives after the war, if with your permission we could stop off at the South Pacific Islands, I'd like to tell you a little story about threads and worship and culture. There was a minister that was sent to one of the islands, and as he arrived, great plans to convert the heathens to Christianity. He built a little chapel, and the chief and the chief's men came into the chapel, filed in behind with the women, all topless. And he was quite distressed by this. This was no way to worship the white man's God. And so he sent home a note to Australia and asked if the ladies could put together some parcels of tops so that the women could pop them on with their grass skirts, and when they enter the little chapel they would be doing it appropriately. So when all the boxes arrived, he was quite thrilled. This was going to be a Sunday of absolute joy. All the women would be covered up. He would be preaching to clothed human beings. So the weekend arrived, the chief and all the men walked in, and they took their place in the little handmade pews in the chapel. And then the chief's wife and all the women followed in on the other side of the chapel. And to his horror, he realised that they had cut holes out of the front of their tops. And of course he had to go on preaching God's word, which he nearly choked and gagged on. And as he got to the end of his service and he blessed everybody and they filed out, of course protocol demanded that he spoke to the chief and the men first. He was dying inside. What could possibly have happened? And he asked the chief's wife, "Why? You've got the tops." And she proudly beamed back, "Yes, look, we're wearing them." He said, "You've altered them a little bit. You've cut holes over your breasts so that, well, they frankly look like headlights." And she said, "Yes, but we wore them. You see, in our culture, only the prostitutes cover their breasts, sir." And I look at those threads and I think, how dare we, when we went to India, and we all know the story, we forced them to wear little, what they call blouses. My daughter was over there for a few months, 9 months working, and under the saris were the little English blouses that were created as law. You must cover up your breasts. And we changed the way they expressed their threads because we didn't understand. I was invited by one of my friends in Newcastle to go to Bendigo. Her grandma had bequeathed her 3,000 dresses, and those 3,000 dresses were from over 100 years. So we went with a team of 5 of us in a car to Bendigo. I, the designer, anthropologist, you know what that is, just a study of humankind, past and present. My daughter Tori, who's a visual anthropologist and a documentary filmmaker. Hannah, the award-winning photographer. My lifetime friend, Lindy Chamberlain. And April, who, well actually Lindy is a tailoress and a seamstress and a great purveyor and anthropologist herself when it comes to history. And April, the website developer and part owner of the family collection of 3,000 garments. I thought as we went through the 3,000 clothes all lined up in a room that this would take maybe a day. 3 days later, thankfully Lindy knew how to process all this. I learnt much from her actually. As we went through them, we divided them up. The Bendigo Theatrical Society. I could feel Nana Pat's energy in every coat hanger. The early Australiana was the second grouping that we divided them into. Hand-done tatting, some of them probably off the first fleet, they were so old. And then overseas designers like Chanel were hanging on wire coat hangers. And then an interesting bunch, I didn't know a lot about them. They were the Melbourne seamstresses or couturiers. So we put them in a little bunch as well. We drove back to Melbourne and we asked if we could see Kate, the curator of the fashion of Melbourne National Gallery. She agreed to see us. Very politely and professionally, didn't recognise Lindy. Well, she did, but professionally didn't. And we sat down and we talked about these threads that I had seen, 3,000 of them. And I suggested to Kate that some of the garments off the first fleet would be worth looking at. Kate took up the opportunity and drove out to Bendigo. But to my surprise, she chose 5 pieces. And they were from the couturiers of Melbourne. Because just like the little pubs that were scattered through Melbourne, there were the little seamstresses and the couturiers, and they were building an anthropological, if you like, capsule of the history of clothing design in Melbourne. So she took 5 of those garments. Linda and I spent a couple of days in Melbourne, and it was there that she requested that, I'm going away for a year up to Broome, Jean. I'm wondering, I've got a lot of boxes packed that are to go to Canberra Art Gallery and Museum, the National Gallery, and I'm scared of bushfires. Can I leave them in your atelier, in your studio? So a couple of days later they all arrived, lots of big boxes and then a number of little small boxes that we put on the shelves in my studio. Lindy's like a sister to me. Her father was in attendance at my mother's funeral many years ago, so we go way back. He was the minister. And as I placed all the boxes there, she said to me, you know, Jean, you feel free to look at anything. The wedding dress you made for me, to my design, all those things. You feel free to go through any of the boxes and have a look. And I thanked her, and off she went. Well, it was many months before I decided that I would have a look with all my staff. We looked at all the big boxes and we put them all out. I chastised a few of them. You could have done better seam finishes on that one when you made that one for her outfit. And we smiled at some of the things that we'd made for her over her journey. And then we got on with our work, and it was one Sunday I was there on my own, and I'd gone in to cut some garments for my clients. And I thought, I might have a look at the little boxes. So I put the white paper out on my table, like I always do, covered it carefully, and I started to unpack all the little boxes. And as I looked at these little shapes, I realised if these threads could speak, I was looking at 2 stories. I was looking at the story of a woman, my sister's age, a little bit older, and I was looking at a story of a little princess who only stayed on this earth for 9 weeks. And I don't know how long it was probably hours. I stared and I thought, like I do, I'm a designer, speak to me. What is your story? Tell me your story. I packed them all up some hours later, and I thought to myself, they're going to a gallery. I hope there's a wonderful curator in that gallery, that Wen and his staff, like we have here in this gallery, I hope they unpack them with the love and the care, because they will go to form a wing in our gallery of the history, our history, in our own backyard, of that 10-year period when a woman's life was changed. In fact, a woman's life was changed because for 3 years she languished in a jail, and there was some threads. A hiker found a little matinee jacket, and that was what changed history for Lindy. And I share this story with you because amongst all of our history, the Ned Calais, if these threads could speak, the yarns they would tell. We celebrate those that protect those artefacts. We celebrate those people, the galleries that see the value in preserving and keeping carefully the history of this nation. It was a great honour for me to unwrap those boxes. Lindy came and took them all, and now they stay in the gallery in Canberra, of which her family can, with special appointments, have a look at, but they're out of everyone's reach and care for history. I share with you this story as there are so many stories of the threads that speak in history, through religion, through our own backyard. And I look out today as I walked in and I saw this most amazing sculptor from somebody that is in dear to us. And it's an enormous joy to be greeted by Brett Whiteley's defining sculpture, Black Totem 2. If for me there was one word left in the English language, I would want it to be hope. And that's what it feels like when you see a brand new egg, hope. And to Ron, Mr. Ramsey, we are very blessed in Newcastle to have you here. And I often think we have so much more to say. This song has to be sung. This music has to be played. Don't let the conductor leave the house. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Jean, for sharing your story with us. And when we walk past Jean BAS studio in Derby Street, we'll think of tonight and her story, If These Threads Could Speak. I draw your attention to the Chanel beautiful outfit, suit, black suit over here to my right. And behind the wall here are examples of Madeleine Vianney's work.